Buenas tardes. Hoy tenemos la presentación del profesor Joseph Farquharson titulada Corpus Planning for the English-Related Creoles of the Caribbean, Progress and Prospects. El doctor Joseph Farquharson es profesor titular del Departamento de Lengua, Lingüística y Filosofía de la Universidad de las Indias Occidentales, Jamaica. Sus áreas de investigación incluyen la lingüística descriptiva de los idiomas del Caribe, la lexicografía, la morfología, la lingüística antropológica y los estudios culturales. Algunas de sus publicaciones son Song-Speech Acts, Towards an Analysis of Participant Roles in Jamaican Dancehall Music, y Linguistic Ideologies and the Historical Development of Language Use Patterns in Jamaican Music. Ph.D. Joseph Farquharson is full professor of the Department of Language, Linguistics, and Philosophy of the University of West Indies, Jamaica. His research areas include descriptive linguistics of Caribbean languages, lexicography, morphology, anthropological linguistics, and cultural studies. Some of his publications are Song-Speech Acts, Towards an Analysis of Participant Roles in Jamaican Dancehall Music, and Linguistic Ideologies and the Historical Development of Language Use Patterns in Jamaican Music. Thank you for joining us today.
But I'm not there as yet. So welcome everybody. Thanks for turning up to hear about corpus planning and English-related Creoles in the Caribbean. And what I'm doing, I'm kind of doing a state of the art or where we are now and my sort of vision for where I think we should be heading. Now, this presentation is not going to be theoretical at all, and that is deliberate because given what I am proposing and some of the criticisms I make of the work that has been done before, I couldn't then come and present that is something that is highly theoretical. And so what I want to do is to have to talk to you for a while about the work that has been done, the work that is being done, and the work to be done. And then we can have a discussion afterwards. So what I'll be talking about today are the English lexicon Creoles of the Caribbean. And I have on the screen a quotation from a newspaper article. This is from Jamaica by someone called Danny Roberts, who is quite famous in Jamaica. But it's interesting what he says about Jamaican Creole, which I will regularly refer to in this presentation as Jamaican. And this was in the context, I believe, of a national campaign that we had launched in the year 2019, petitioning the government of Jamaica to make the Jamaican language official alongside English. And so Robert says, outside of music and culture, patois cannot get us through the gateway into the globalized world. If we cannot understand concepts in English, then we ought to be taught English properly. Because if we have to resort to an explanation only in patois, by the way, patois is the language that many Jamaicans use to refer to what linguists call Jamaican Creole or Jamaican. So if we have to resort to an explanation only in patois, then we are placing limitations on one class of people to exceed beyond the shores of Jamaica's inner city into a world that must become our oyster. Perhaps that is why the music that depicts patois flourishes. We must teach our children to speak, write, and read standard English. Nobody is taught patois. Patois is an oral dialect which cannot so far be used in commerce or any official interactions. And that is perhaps not even true, since our music is official and all official documentations are in English, which it serves the artists well to understand. And so I've taken Roberts as an example of sentiments in the population. And there's a colleague of mine who refers to the set or the group that Roberts belongs to as the chattering classes. So these are people who talk a lot. They presume to have insights about language, about linguistics, and a whole lot of other subjects. But they are not, they think that they're speaking on behalf of the general Jamaican population, or the general population in Trinidad and Tobago or Barbados, etc. And if we go throughout the English official countries of the Caribbean, I could find something like this in every one of them in any of their newspapers. So this is a discussion that has been happening for centuries in these territories about the place of the contact languages formed from the contact between English and African languages in the colonial era. Now, because of the manner in which these languages came about, there's this stigma attached to them that they're slave language, that they are not real languages, and that we should try to forget them. That was the sentiment in, let's say, the 1930s, 40s, or even 50s, that we should try to get this thing behind us as quickly as possible and learn English, because only English can move us forward. But then in the 1960s, 70s, in the period of independence for most of these territories, something started to happen that the languages designated as Creoles started to become the languages of national identity. So people, speakers of the languages, even where they didn't believe that they were full languages, that they were good languages, started using them as vehicles for expressing national identity. And this is both in the Caribbean as well as when they go abroad. So Jamaicans in the diaspora, Trinidadians or Trinbagonians in the diaspora, Bajans and Dominicans in the diaspora, will commonly use their Creole languages as markers of identity. And outside of Jamaica, if you come across another Jamaican, that person is not going to ask you if you speak English. What they're going to want to hear from you is the language of their heart. And again, this is even if they themselves don't believe it's a full language. So these languages took a turn. Jamaican is probably the prime exemplar of these languages in how much it has become a symbol of national identity. And a big part of that has to do with the role that it plays in Jamaican music and the fact that Jamaican music is now international. I speak of reggae and dancehall and the global visibility and impact that these musical genres have. Um, so this is the sentiment. And so for a very long time, scholars who work on Creole languages were pretty much engaged in doing work to get the speakers of the languages to come to a realization that they are indeed languages, that they have structure, they have rules, and that they did not have to feel ashamed of speaking Creole languages. And so this is what I call the long twilight of status planning. So it comes kind of in the evening of these countries and their push for independence and their finding themselves in nationhood. But that has been a very long period stretching over several decades. And so the work carried out by linguists, where they compiled dictionaries, where they wrote grammars, where they did research on different aspects of the grammar or the sociolinguistic situation of these languages, much of that was meant to indicate to the speakers of Creoles that, hey, these are languages. Here's the structure. Here's how they came about. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. Um, Linguists have entered the public domain from time to time. And so linguists have kind of operated on two fronts. One is within academia, where they do their research and publication because they're interested in knowledge, and also because they want to move up the ladder in terms of promotion. But also there is the other side, where linguists enter the public debate on these languages with the goal of influencing the views of speakers of these languages. And so in a particular period of Creole linguistics, especially in that period when native linguists had started to emerge, um, conversations were had in the public domain about these languages. So you'd see linguists writing from time to time in the national press, or they'd appear on radio or on television, talking about these languages and the place they should hold in society, the place they should hold in education or different organs of the state. This period is not yet done. And so, although what I want to focus on is the period of corpus planning, we have not yet exited the status planning period, and that is going to be ongoing. And I believe later on, I have more to say on that, and how it is that code selection and corpus planning will feed into the status planning. So status planning has to do with the work of influencing how speakers and and other people who speakers interact with, influencing the ways in which they view and evaluate the language. And that comes in the form of what domains can the language be used in? What sort of things can you use the language for? Is the language going to be used by the state in interaction with citizens? Can citizens use the language when they are seeking the services of the state? So status planning aims to influence the views of speakers and also those persons who speakers interact with, of the language about the place of the language in the community. So Devonish, that's Hubert Devonish, in his PhD thesis, which was completed in 1978 or 1979, had put together a particular way of approaching selecting a code for Guyanese Creole, which is referred to as Creolese by most of its speakers. Now, that is necessary in a context like Guyana, and this is repeated in other territories such as Jamaica, territories such as Trinidad and Tobago, probably Barbados too. And these are the territories that have been described as having what is called a Creole continuum, what David de Camp referred to as the post-Creole continuum, which means that we don't only have the Creole, which is based on English, but we also have English in the speech community. But in addition to those two extreme poles, we have a lot of variation in between. And so Devonish thought it was necessary in a situation of standardization and institutionalization to select one of those codes or a code for standardization. And the continuum situation presents quite a few challenges for linguists, especially when it comes to standardization. Whose code do you select? Do you select what is referred to as the baselect, which is the most conservative form of the Creole language? Do you select mesolectal varieties, which are supposed to be somewhere between the baselect and the acrolect or the standard variety of English? And then if you choose a mesolectal variety, how do you go about selecting the features? And so Devonish's work was meant to provide a method for selecting one code over the other. And I think what he did wasn't so much to select an existing code, but he, in essence, invented a code. And I'll tell you why um, he did that. So I'll go forward and then come back to his, his steps. So for code selection, Devonish took the guidance of Beckles and Carrington, who in 1975 had suggested that for any variety that would be that would become the standard variety, that it must be neutral. It must not be based on the known structure of one of the varieties that is expected to occur. Um, and I believe they proposed that so that no one group would feel privileged that their variety was selected, as well as no other group would feel slighted because some other group's variety was selected and not theirs. So it was the quest for a neutral variety. Also, it must be capable of handling with equal efficiency any system within the complex. In other words, at the level of practical application, any sentence that occurs in the data must be analyzable in the same terms. And here they're dealing with that continuum situation where you want to ensure that for any feature that is selected at one point of the continuum, it adequately represents equivalent forms at other points in the continuum. And this is so as not to be too jarring to people who do not use that specific variety. So what Devonish came up with, and he provided a sample text, was something that probably represented nobody's Guyanese Creole, but then would not feel completely strange to any speaker of Guyanese Creole. And of course, that is common in the case of already standard languages like English, when you think about formal written English versus everyday English. So written English is really, written formal English is really nobody's English. But then when you take it up and read it, it doesn't feel completely odd unless this person is going above and beyond, unless you're reading a philosopher like Sartre in English, or a translation of Derrida into English. But it feels natural enough, although the person reading it might not have phrased it in that way in their variety. So Devonish's steps towards standardization. Step one is that you would have to devise a standard writing system for the Creole language being dealt with. And for the English lexicon Creoles, they are lucky in that regard, because in the 1950s, Frederick Cassidy, in his work on Jamaican, had devised a phonemic writing system for the Jamaican language. And that system was debuted, the system debuted in his 1961 book, Jamaica Talk. It came to be used in Beryl Bailey's Grammar of Jamaican in 1966, and then the Dictionary of Jamaican English, which Frederick Cassidy co-compiled with Robert LePage. And then other linguists have taken it up, and it is kind of the standard way of representing Jamaican in academic work these days. The only thing which is unfortunate is that the writing system has not gained a lot of traction among ordinary Jamaicans. And so ordinary Jamaicans still use more or less the I dialect system, meaning they take the standard English writing system and they will change letters here and there in order to indicate dialectal or non-standard pronunciations. But English linguists continue to push the Cassidy system. In the early years of the 2000s, the Jamaican Language Unit did a slight revision to the Cassidy system, and so it's now referred to as the Cassidy JLU writing system. Now, other territories have taken the system that Cassidy devised for Jamaican and have applied it with modification to their own language. So I know that Guyana has done that. Belize has tried to strike some sort of compromise between an I dialect system and the phonemic system. In many cases, they lean more towards the I dialect system, but there are echoes of Cassidy's system in the writing system that they have worked out. And then there are territories like San Andres and Providencia that have English-related Creoles descended from Jamaica, most people believe, who use the Cassidy writing system, again, with modifications. And so there is a standard writing system for many of these English-related Creoles, just that they are not very common among the populace in these various territories. Also, the standardizing of its morphosyntactic system, and this is what Devonish attempted in his thesis from the 1970s in devising standard morphosyntax for the variety that would become institutionalized. And he did that in some cases by looking at frequency, in other cases by looking at the restrictions in terms of variation. So the co-occurrence restrictions that a particular form or feature had. And so the more restricted a feature was in terms of its distribution, is the less likely that it would get selected for the standard code unless there was a greater cultural significance for using this form over another. And then developing the development of an efficient system for generating modern and sometimes technical vocabulary items in the language. And this has probably been the weakest area, because while researchers have been working on the morphosyntax of Creole languages, not necessarily with a view to codification, but work is being done on describing the morphosyntax. But in the area of creating technical vocabulary, we have not done so well at all. And so that's one of the areas that we'll have to step up on. So since the 1970s, we have come a long way. I believe we are just at the cusp of moving over into the corpus planning period, era, although in truth, there's no real sharp divide between the two, and so they overlap in a lot of areas. And so we're really not looking for the status planning era to come to a close. and then we begin the corpus planning era, that they are operating side by side, and that will happen for a good while until things are settled, until these languages become official languages. Now, we have to consider that there are two main problems in making these languages official in their respective territories. Chief among which is that English is not legally the official language in most, if any, of these territories. So for most of these territories, there isn't any legislation that says English is the official language of this country. That is certainly not the case in Jamaica. I doubt it's the case in Guyana, and so on and so forth. And so if um, we were to make Bajan Creole official in Barbados, then it would receive official status, legal official status, ahead of Barbadian English or standard Barbadian English. And so what would have to happen is that at the same time that we move to make Bajan or Jamaican or Trinidadian English Creole or Bahamian English Creole official, there would have to be a move to also inscribe into law the officialization of the various Englishes or standard Englishes that are used in these territories. The other problem, I believe, is because English is the global language. And because English is the global language, there is a pushback when there's any suggestion that speakers of Creole languages should learn anything but English or should learn in any other language but English. Because lots of people within the various countries believe that teaching in Creole in the school will hinder the progress or the cognitive development of children. Of course, there's no scientific basis for this, but such is the sentiment among power brokers in these various Caribbean countries. So since Devonish's early work in the 1970s to find a variety for codification in Guyana, the situation has changed. Now we have several universities and institutes that have been describing these languages and also that have been pushing for official status for these languages. And I'll mention this is not an exhaustive list. Of course, the University of the West Indies at all its campuses in Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, the university is involved in the study and promotion of these various languages. And then there are various institutes that have come up since Devonish's work. Devonish has a let me just check the date on this, a 1983 publication, which was published in what is essentially conference proceedings put out by the Society for Caribbean Linguistics. And in his 1983 paper, what he proposes is the setting up of an institute for the officialization, the standardization of English Creoles. And so it's interesting to watch that proposal or to read that proposal and then see how things developed. And so looking back in hindsight, we see that the Institute didn't necessarily go how he had planned, but we do have things that are carrying out some aspects of his vision. So there's the Jamaican language unit, which is paired with the Unit for Caribbean Language Research. And those two, that twin institute was actually set up by Professor Emeritus Hubert Devonish. Then there's the Richard and Jeanette Alsop Center for Caribbean Lexicography, which of course is concentrated on lexicographic description of Caribbean languages, not just the English lexicon Creoles, but whatever languages are spoken in the Caribbean. There's the Guyana Languages Unit, which is fairly recent, but is doing extremely important work, not only in respect of the Creole, the English Creole spoken in Guyana, but also the indigenous languages of Guyana. And then the International Center for Caribbean Language Research, ICCLR, which was also set up by Devonish. And I believe the ICCLR is essentially what he had dreamt about in the 1970s, 80s, this institute that he spoke about. But what the ICCLR has become is really an umbrella organization taking in the Jamaican Language Unit, Unit for Caribbean Language Research, and the Guyana Languages Unit, providing guidance and in some cases funding for the work that these units do. So now we do have dedicated institutes in addition to the universities that are concerned with standardization and promotion of these languages. So what is the existing policy framework? Since the 1940s, in 1948, we have had the UN Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where language is mentioned as one of those inalienable rights of human beings. It says everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration without distinction of any kind, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. And so since then, we have started to see a foregrounding of language. Then later on, in the 1990s, the UNESCO has started to celebrate International Mother Language Day, and that has helped to focus the spotlight on indigenous languages, including Creole languages. So, for example, St. Lucia every year will celebrate International Mother Language Day, and St. Lucia also celebrates Creole Day, which is later on in the year. International Mother Language Day is held sometime in February. And so that gives some sort of focus to Creole languages. The UN has also proposed, well, in fact, it has been passed 2022 to 2032, that decade, as the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. And so again, that will be a chance for Creole languages and other indigenous languages of the Caribbean to get some focus, to get some spotlight. And the UN did that in order to facilitate economic empowerment, inclusion, and development. I'm reading from the UN document, to improve social, cultural, civil, and political engagement of indigenous peoples, to achieve greater economic independence, and to build more sustainable and resilient communities. And why this is important is because what is taking place currently in Creole using societies is that speakers of Creole languages, especially if they are monolingual speakers, are excluded from many of the national functions. So yes, they do participate in a good part of the economy, but then there are certain aspects, certain levels of economic work that they are excluded from on the basis that those areas are conducted in English, a language that they either do not speak or that they have limited control of. And so this will be an opportunity to ensure that they gain greater economic independence, and also that the communities that use these languages become more resilient. In 2011, and this was one of the main outputs, or has been one of the main outputs of ICCLR, the International Center for Caribbean Language Research. They had a meeting in Kingston, Jamaica. And at that meeting, they had a discussion and signing of a charter on language policy and language rights in the Creole-speaking Caribbean. And the charter doesn't only speak about Creole languages, but it also speaks about the non-Creole languages that are indigenous to the Caribbean. So Article 50 of that charter, for example, says in order to effect the rights set forth in parts 2, 3A, 3B, and 4, states, that's Caribbean states, must take the necessary steps to develop, where necessary, the capacity of languages to function in public administration and in education, and to prepare language communities attitudinally, that's a status planning, and practically, corpus planning, for the implementation of the rights. Such steps may include, but are not limited to, the following activities. Sorry if this is too small. The selection, not even I can read it in the red. Apologies for the font choice, but it looked much clearer. So the selection of an appropriate variety of the language for codification, for standardization, also the development of appropriate vocabulary. Again, you are here seeing echoes of Devonish's 1978 and 1983 work. Additionally, the selection or development and standardization and popularization of a writing system, the formulation of styles and registers appropriate to public administration, because currently most of these languages are seen as informal codes. So English is reserved for public formal functions, and Creoles are reserved for private, intimate, and informal functions. And so there would be a need to develop registers of the language to align with its use or their use in public formal domains. The development of instructional material in the particular language, the training of teachers to deliver competent instruction in the language, both as medium of instruction and as a subject, the training of competent translators and interpreters for the system of public administration, the training of police, judiciary, and court recording clerks, reporters, to represent and read the language in its written form, public education activities, including the promotion of those languages which are minority, indigenous, and or in low status, or in, or, sorry, and or low in status, and then the passage of appropriate enabling legislation. So this was all set out in the charter, which is available online. So I'm going to step back a bit in order to come forward, and this is to give you a sense of what has happened so far. So corpus planning and code selection is not happening in a vacuum. It's not that we are inventing the wheel now, neither are we seeking to reinvent the wheel. That for many of these varieties, work does exist that feeds into corpus planning. So for example, in terms of dictionaries, there are dictionaries for several of the English-related Creoles. You will see the dictionary in the names English, but this is because many of them were created in a period where the Creoles were seen as varieties of English. And so when you see Dictionary of Jamaican English, that Dictionary of Jamaican English covers the whole gamut of the continuum in Jamaica, stretching from the Basilect to the Acrolect. So there's a Dictionary of Jamaican English from 1967, the Dictionary of Bahamian English, 1982, Dictionary of Caribbean English Usage, which covers about 18 or so English official territories of the Caribbean. And then there's a Dictionary of the English / Creole of Trinidad and Tobago from 2009. And so there is coverage of the lexicon of many of these varieties. Belize has a dictionary, and there are other dictionaries popping up. And here I'm making specific reference to scholarly dictionaries. There are also works created by lay people. And of course, those will feed into corpus planning and are important in the whole process. Now, I have titled this segment From Scholarship to Application, because for a lot of these publications, and I'll say the same, it also applies to the next slide that I have, which is on morphosyntax and grammar descriptions, that for all of these works, they are academic works, and they end up being kind of collections or compendia of curiosities. So the Dictionary of Jamaican English is a decent sized tome. The Dictionary of the English / Creole of Trinidad and Tobago is huge, but it's not a dictionary that children can take to school with them. Yeah. So it ends up being something additional. In essence, a reference work that you consult additionally, but then there is still the normal English dictionary, whether the Oxford or the Collins or the Webster's, that you consult on a regular basis. And so that means there is really very few cases in which there is a dictionary of the Creole. Belize is an exception. The English Creoles of Suriname, they are exceptions because there are dictionaries for them. But many of the territories that have this continuum thing going on, we find an absence of dictionaries that are dedicated to the Creole, as opposed to some kind of merger of an English / Creole dictionary. Then for the grammars, there we go. For the grammars, we have the Jamaican Creole syntax, written in the, or done in the transformational paradigm of the 1960s, that is Chomsky and linguistics, and that was done by Beryl Bailey. A grammar of Antiguan Creole, still in thesis form as far as I know, by Bernadette Farquhar, 1974. The Speech of Trinidad, a reference grammar by Dennis Solomon, 1993. A contrastive grammar of Islander, that's by Barton's, Grammaire Dunenge, Introduction au Longaluku, Njuka e Pamaka, by Guri and Miga, from 2003. A Concise Grammar of Guyanese Creole by Devonish and Thompson, 2010, and the Grammar of Sarmacan by McWhirter and Good from 2012. Now, what unites all of these grammars is that every single one of them are technical grammars of the language. So they are written with linguists in mind, not lay people. And so I remember having a conversation with Devonish very recently, and he was saying when he was a student doing linguistics at the University of Guyana, this is his undergraduate studies, he found Beryl Bailey's Jamaican Creole syntax difficult to understand. So you can just imagine somebody who is not studying linguistics, who is not in a university context, doesn't have the benefit of university education, that it's going to be more difficult, if not impossible, for them to understand what is going on there. And so there is a need for grammars that that lay people can read. So then what approach should we take to codification? How then do we come upon codification, whether this is in the domain of the lexicon, describing what is there, and also creating new vocabulary, or in the area of morphosyntax? There are several approaches, either expert-driven, where the expert goes about describing the language, and then in the vein of Devonish, not that this was what he would ultimately implement, but create a system, a code for the language using all of his expertise, and then saying, here is the standardized form. So that's the expert-driven approach. Then there's the community or usage-driven approach, which still involves the linguists, but what is happening here is that you depend completely upon the community to determine what will become standard or not. That approach is good. It empowers the community, but sometimes the linguistic decisions that are made can become entangled in political decisions, in identity, whether that's ethnic or religious, etc., geographical, socio-economic issues, where one group wants their variety to be represented and not another. So that would be driven by the community. And then there's this combined approach where you do need the linguist, but the linguist first looks at what is it that the community is doing, and then how can the linguist be informed by what the community is doing, and then add his or her expertise to produce something that is acceptable to the community and has the benefit of technical knowledge. And it's the third approach that I would propose. So the situation we find ourselves in now is that there is an absence in practically all of these territories of general purpose or learner dictionaries. Belize might be the only exception. I'm still supposed to look at Bettina Miga's Dictionary of Nenge to see to what extent it is usable by a general audience. But in most cases, what we're dealing with are dictionaries produced for a highly educated audience. And so there is a need for general purpose dictionaries. Also, there's an absence of pedagogical grammars. I'm not aware of any existing except Beryl Bailey's grammar from the 1960s, I believe, which was commissioned by the American Peace Corps for the teaching of its volunteers. But outside of that, I can't really think of a pedagogical grammar that was created by a linguist. Now, that is interesting because if we are very concerned about the status of these languages within their respective communities and helping those communities to move forward on the officialization front, then we will have to ensure that these things are in place, and that realization or that approach is going to inform my proposal. And then, of course, the slow creation of text in the language, either new or translated. That is changing somewhat because of the liberalization or the democratization of writing. So now anybody can write. They are not necessarily writing in the the standard writing system that linguists use, but more people are writing in Creole these days than 20, 30 years ago. And social media has provided a space for speakers of Creole languages to write their language. Only problem with that is these texts are in widely different places. They might be very short, especially if they're in a place like Twitter that has restrictions on the number of characters. There's still a need to bring them all together into one place. So the Jamaican New Testament was completed in the year 2012, and it was commissioned by the Bible Society of the West Indies. The Jamaican language unit played a role in that, acting as language consultants to the project, to the translators. And we learned a few things from the Jamaican New Testament. So there are two approaches we could take to institutionalization. And to a large extent, we have been using the first. So in that long twilight of status planning, we have been engaged in trying to convince people that these things are languages, they are good. Please give us permission to use the languages in education, to use them in the legal system, etc. That's the approach that we have been using. Then there's the other approach where you do the work and let the work convince them. And I believe that's a significant lesson that we have learned from the Jamaican New Testament, that when it was announced that the New Testament would be translated into Jamaican, there was fierce opposition. People saying, how could you do that? How can you translate the word of God into this bastard language? Or other people who said it was impossible. Creole language, a Creole language can't manage all of the technical vocabulary or something as high and grand as the Bible, as the holy book. And then they did it. They created a translation of the New Testament. And I have seen people starting to warm to it. And it's written in the Cassidy JLU writing system. So not the idyllic system that the population is familiar with. And I have seen people who have absolutely no introduction to linguistics, no introduction to the writing system, read through it and also encourage others to read it. Another wonder is that the Jehovah's Witnesses have adopted the New Testament as their text, and they are doing meetings in Jamaican, completely in Jamaican, with songs in Jamaican, with presentations in Jamaican. And that is a marvel because the Jehovah's Witnesses don't generally use other people's translations. They have their own translation of the Bible into English, so that they're using somebody else's translation of the word of God means that something is happening. And now, of course, the Jamaican New Testament is the largest body of continuous data in the official writing system. All right, so let me wrap up quickly. So then what steps should we take towards codification in the 21st century based on all that we have learned over this period? So I believe we can't continue to use the approach of convincing those in authority that these languages are good languages, etc., and then ask them to give us permission to work. I believe we have to go ahead and do the work, as difficult as that is, notwithstanding that we may be strapped for cash, strapped for funding, but I think we have to do the work. So the lesson from the Jamaican New Testament, do the work and they will follow, is what I am proposing. And of course, that has to be done in the context of the 21st century, that a lot of the backbreaking work that we would have needed to do in the 20th century, some of that is reduced. So Devonish had proposed that we enter the fray by creating radio programs in the Creole languages, and then have the languages used to discuss serious topics on radio. And then from there, from the oral or oral, you would move to producing a newsletter or a magazine in the language. Now, I don't know if anybody listens to radio, but social media offers a space where we can create material and disseminate. And the Jamaican Language Unit has been doing that. The Guyana Languages Unit has been doing that. The Jamaican Language Unit has a YouTube channel called Broadcast Jamaican, and we are building that out into a small scale media entity. So step one, we need recordings and transcription of data in the various languages. Um, and so that could be news and current affair programs. We also need natural language data in the language. And so all of that work done by linguists collecting data in the field, that is still important, that is still relevant. And so we'll need the recordings and we'll need the transcriptions. That is step one. Creating a body of data in the language, or gathering the body of data. And then step two is the translation of 1A and B into English and Spanish where relevant. So areas like Costa Rica, San Andres, and Providencia, Nicaragua might need English translations as well as Spanish translations. And then step three would be the creation of corpora for the language. And step three is important because it's going to drive much of what comes afterwards. And so you create a corpus of X Creole, let's say Bajan Creole, taking from both spoken Bajan and written Bajan. And then you also do the transliteration of texts which are available but written in idialect orthography, and you move them to the standard orthography. And then the creation of parallel corpora in the language. So you'll now have a corpus in Bajan Creole or Bajan, and then you will have the translations into English or Spanish where necessary, so that you have parallel corpora. And I'll tell you why we need parallel corpora. We need parallel corpora because the parallel corpus is going to drive the next phase of the project for standardization and institutionalization. And that is the creation of software. And the creation of software is going to increase the corpus. So you are creating the corpus to make the expansion of the corpus easier. And so this would be software for the text for text recognition. And if we create software that can recognize Creole text, we can move to creating software that can do text to speech conversion and also speech to text transcription. And so you will have the audio file and you can get an automatic generated text from that in the official orthography. And so that will help to increase the corpus. And so you get a larger and larger corpus in the language. And then, of course, we move to the creation of software for automatic translation. And that is going to be important, let's say, in the judicial system, where speakers of Creoles come into the system and they need to be heard by the court, they need representation, automatic translation is available. And then the next step is the use of the corpus to create language-related products. And so that will now be the writing of grammars for teaching pedagogical grammars that for L1 and L2 speakers that will be informed by the data, informed by the corpora. And of course, if we have large enough corpora, then we could look at machine natural language processing and the use of machines to write normative grammars of the language, and then the compilation of dictionaries via computational lexicography. So hopefully there will be a day when I wouldn't have to do the breaking work of going through and writing out definitions, but that a computer could spit out rudimentary definitions for me, and then I will fix that up. So that's where I'll stop. That's my look at the past, and that's my vision for the future, for where these languages should be going. So mi tanko no, muchísimas gracias, and I invite the questions and conversation.
Thank you very much. Do you have time for 1 or 2 questions?
Yes, I didn't realize that I had gone on for 1 hour. Wow.
Perfect. Yes, but we still have time then. ¿Alguna pregunta? Pueden escribirla en el chat o bien consultar directamente. Ok, tenemos la participación de la doctora Gabriela Cruz.
Hablo en inglés. Erika.
Let's try español. How good my Spanish is.
Ok, bueno, muchas gracias por la presentación. Es muy interesante para mí. Es un tema sobre el que soy bastante ignorante, pero me fascina por lo menos la parte de la estandarización y la codificación de las lenguas. Y quería preguntarte sobre cuando mencionaste la creación de nuevos textos en redes sociales. Quería saber si esos son espacios en donde los hablantes escriben espontáneamente en la lengua criolla, o si son espacios en donde hay una conciencia o una intención explícita de usar la lengua de esa forma.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, you're asking about specifically the use of the language by speakers in or writers in this case, yes, in social media spaces. Yes. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct.
Yes. So for all of these languages, they are the heart language of the people. It's just that there is this division in the societies where when you think writing, you think English, and when you think speaking, you think Creole. However, because social media has created a kind of hybrid space where it's almost as if you are speaking to the person, especially if you are doing that in instant messaging in any of the chats, either on Facebook or on Twitter, what's called DMs, or even if you're doing Twitter, you're doing a tweet, but then there's this back and forth between individuals which mimic a conversation. And I believe because there is this sense almost of conversation, this is why speakers are more likely to use Creole in those spaces. So you'll get a mixture of English and Creole. Speakers regularly or users regularly switch between English and Creole, but there are some things that you are definitely going to get Creole for, exclamations, things that relate specifically to certain cultural mores, some ways of being that are intrinsic to their being, you will get represented in Creole. But I believe it's because of that hybrid nature of the social media space why you get so much Creole being used in that space. Outside of that space, if you catch people writing, then they are more likely to use English. By the way, there is another thing that is emerging that undermines writing. And so these days I start to wonder, do we have to teach people to write at all? Because most younger people don't bother to write. They send a voice note. And in many cases, those voice notes are in Jamaican, they're in Bajan, they're in Guyanese, they're not in English. And so even if we're seeing the fall off of literacy, the new technology seem to be supporting the use of the language, or put in a better way, speakers are co-opting the new technologies for the use of their languages, and in most cases without shame at all. Thanks for the question. Very, very useful question.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is from Raquel Sanchez. What is the role of creative writers and contemporary literature in the process of development of the corpora?
Oh, okay, good question, excellent question. It is rare to have literary works completely in any of these Creole languages. You do have some authors who do write exclusively in Creole. So for example, I'm forgetting the name of the author from Guyana, but definitely there's the famous Louise Bennett from Jamaica. There are some dub poets who will use more Creole than English, but dub poetry tends to have a mixture of the codes. And in any case, dub poetry is really meant to be performed and read aloud. So there are not as many texts in the language. And this is because most writers see themselves as writing for an international audience, and they do not want to limit their audience. And because of that view, then they tend to write in English. Now, they might do several things. They'll write in English, so the narration, the narrative is in English, but then they include Creole words in the narrative to give local flavor. So of course they'll have to refer to specific things like ackee or rice and peas or roti or doubles, etc. To reflect the local context. But then of course dialogue would be, or some of the dialogue would be in Creole. But again, many of them, especially where there is a continuum, will try to inflect the language so that an English reader will understand what is going on, or an English reader will think he or she understands what is going on. So if we take Marlon James's work called, oh my God, what's the name of his work? The title has slipped me, but it won the Man Booker Prize the other day. That is written in a way that has a Creole inflection, but it's predominantly in English. And many writers choose this because of the need for a larger audience. There are writers, as I said, Louise Bennett, whose poetry is completely in Jamaican, but of course she used the idialect system. There are some authors who choose to. I know there's an author, Joan Andrea Hutchinson from Jamaica, who is now seeking to convert, to transliterate her poetry, which was originally represented in the idialect system, to the Cassidy JLU system, but the work already exists in idialect system. Outside of that, it would be for the Jamaican language unit to encourage authors to write using the Cassidy JLU system and to help them market the works so that they don't end up losing, or the Guyana languages unit in the case of Guyana. And then there's always the option where the works exist in idialect system, in Creole, then we transliterate into the Cassidy JLU system and include them in the corpus. And that's something that we are undertaking.
Okay, thank you. And now we have another question. Some scholars say that what speakers of Creole languages really want to learn or to be educated on are the international languages of reference, English, French, or Spanish. What is your opinion in this regard?
Okay, I don't even have to offer an opinion. It is the truth. They want to learn the international languages. But because of, for many speakers, because of the psychological damage that has been done to them over decades, over years, which tells them that their language is not good enough, there is a sort of a replacive approach that you need to replace your first language in order to learn any of these international languages well. And so that's the sort of thing that linguists have tried to guard against, that speakers don't see this as a replacive process. You don't have to replace your L1 in order to learn these international languages. Now, in the case of Jamaican, I can say, for a very long time, those who opposed officialization or standardization kept on saying, well, what are we going to do with the Jamaican language? Nobody outside of Jamaica speaks the language. That is no longer true. There are lots of people outside Jamaica who want to learn the language, and for various reasons, either because they are descended from Jamaicans, so they are children in the diaspora, so children of people who were born in Jamaica, and they are interested in learning the language as a part of finding themselves and their heritage. And then there are non-Jamaicans in numerous countries, in France, in Italy, in Germany, in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Zimbabwe, in Kenya, Nigeria, Ghana, who Uganda, who want to learn the language because it's associated with reggae and dancehall music. And many Jamaicans don't see that, don't understand that. In one paper I wrote, I said that most Jamaicans see Jamaica in terms of what Jamaicans need to get from outsiders, and not what outsiders might want from Jamaicans. And in that, we miss an opportunity. So yes, many Jamaicans, many Bajans, many Guyanese see, think that what is necessary is just to learn the international language, and then they will take off. But in any case, most of these societies have been at this for several decades, and it has not worked. And so linguists have been saying, could we try another method, a method that is based on research, where you start children off in their L1 and then you transition to L2, instead of denigrating the L1, you praise it, you use it as the foundation for literacy, and move children into learning English, into learning French and Spanish, etc. So when we launched that campaign in 2019, the campaign was deliberately called Petition for Making the Jamaican Language Official Alongside English. And then there were even people at the university level, lecturers at university, who were saying, oh no, you're going to get rid of English. We said, but the petition is called Make the Language Official Alongside English. So there's no plan to replace English, but to have these languages being co-official.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any other question? Okay, well, perfect.
If I may, I see Raquel Santos says poetry is another genre where the spoken language becomes formalized in writing. That is true. And not only poetry, what has been important for the English-related Creoles in the Caribbean is also music. So if we think about soca music in places like Trinidad, Guyana, Barbados, reggae and dancehall in Jamaica, calypso again in Trinidad and Tobago, in Barbados, um, those genres have been responsible for the greater acceptance of the languages and also the further dissemination of those languages. So, and that is understandable because in a situation where the languages are seen as being restricted to oral domains or oral use and not written, one can understand why they would have a foothold in genres that are meant to be oral. So let's say, for example, Louise Bennett's poetry. Louise Bennett's poetry is written, but everybody understands that her poetry is meant to be read aloud or performed. And so, yes, poetry and I would add music are extremely important for the officialization or the institutionalization of these languages.
Okay, perfect. Additionally, Dr. Comments, I think the resources in computational linguistics are fundamental for a better future of the Creole languages.
Yes, and that's because we just don't have the resources, the financial resources. We do not have the resources. And even the resources to get the computational work off the ground is very often not there. And so partnerships are important for us. But once we get that foundation, that opens up all sorts of possibilities. And so we can, in short order, work smarter and not harder. So if we can, which is why I gave those different steps, and that each step is meant to do work to ensure that the next step is much easier, that we have the material, we have the groundwork for moving to the next step. And so our work becomes much easier because when you have a significant enough corpus, then the question is not about whether or not you can create a dictionary, but it's how many dictionaries, what different types of dictionaries can you create given the data that you have. And so that's why you're right. The computational work is extremely crucial for under-resourced languages.
Okay, perfect. Professor Antonio?
No, I just wanted to add that also in terms of acceptability of the languages is very important. For example, now you have Google in several languages, and that was very important, for example, for Swahili and other languages, indigenous languages, for example, that you can use with Google. That's fundamental for that. Yeah.
Because people's perception of their language, their evaluation of their language, is wrapped up in what they can do with that language. So can they do it to, can they use it to get jobs, etc. What resources exist for the language? Which is why I said the Jamaican New Testament, the translation, taught us a lot. That instead of sitting down trying to convince people, do the work. And so when a speaker finds that there is a grammar of the language, say, oh, this thing is a grammar, has a grammar. So probably then it is a language. Oh, look, there's a dictionary. And I remember having a conversation with a Bahamian about what they call Bahamian dialect, which I would just call Bahamian, Bahamian English Creole. And the person was saying, oh, there's no Creole in the Bahamas. yeah, we speak a dialect of English, but there's no Creole like Jamaica has and so on. And so on. I said, yeah, but there is a Creole. This Creole has been described. And I remember running to my room. I was a student then, a graduate student, and getting Home and Schilling's Dictionary of Bahamian English and showing it to them. And then they started to stutter. Okay, but there's no grammar of the language. And so, you know, they'll start checking off that list. And so what we have to do is to ensure that for every item on that list that they will check off, we have it. And so once they say, oh, but it has no this, we say, but there we have a grammar. But you can't teach this language to other people. I said, but yeah, we have a course, Jamaican for beginners, and there are people who are enrolled in this course. I said, oh. So I think what we have to do is little by little disarm them by producing the work. It's going to be difficult for us because it involves the use of resources, the marshalling of resources that we don't have. But I think that's going to be absolutely necessary. The Jamaican expression for that is action, not a bag of mouth, meaning action is what counts, not words, not just mere words. So show me, don't just tell me. And so we are in the showing phase, the doing phase, not just the saying.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Raquel Sanchez just adds very exciting work.
Gracias.
Okay, since there are no more questions, I just want to say once again, thank you very much for sharing with us today. Y antes de terminar, me gustaría recordar que mañana a las 10 tenemos la presentación del profesor Federico Go titulada Esperanto in the Web After COVID, Current Challenges and Opportunities for the Linguistic Community of Practice. Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos y buenas tardes.
Buenas tardes, Mitan Kunu.
All right, Mitan Kunu again, if you invite me.